At your command, the ancient device became your instrument, spinning to life with deafening resonance and gathering up the swirling essence like thread on a great spindle. There, in the pale pulsing glow of the machine that set you on this path long ago, you summoned all your strength, focusing on your objective and blocking out all else. With a single concussive blast that rocked the chamber and sent you tumbling to the ground, you freed the souls from their stasis. Exhausted, your consciousness slipping away, your last sight was of the machine, dark and dormant. Then your eyes closed, and sleep welcomed you at long last. After coming to and searching for some time, you discovered the route Theos used to enter Sun in Shadow, and embarked on a long and arduous ascent back to the surface. You emerged in Ter Evron after days of tunneling through the rubble Theos had left behind, and when you stepped into the daylight, you were faced with a different Deerwood than the one you had left. At your direction, the souls diverted by Theos were guided back to the vessels originally meant for them. For the first time, parents of hollow-born children woke to the cries of their infants and looked into their eyes to see them staring back. People fell to their knees where they stood, thanking Helia or Mogren or even Aethys for their forgiveness of whatever guilt they felt they bore. But for all the relief that had come to some parents, others only found new grief. For many thousands of Hollowborn had died during Wideone's legacy, many by their parents' own hands. For those children, there would be no homecoming. Yet the last Hollow birth was in the past now, and those parents willing to risk trying for a new child were frequently rewarded, often with twins. Many felt they saw Helia's hand in it, and the year would be remembered as the year of Helia's splendor. Lord Radric's zeal had brought him back to life once, but it would not do so again. Radric's destruction at your hands spelled the end of his suffocating rule over Gilded Vale and the surrounding area. In his absence, the village prospered, becoming a popular destination for new settlers anxious to leave Defiance Bay after the riots. Without a nearby ruler, it also grew more wild, with many settlers moving on as soon as they'd arrived, turned off by lawlessness that was excessive even by Deerwooden standards. Nevertheless, despite the challenges of living there, Gilded Vale had survived, and would continue to survive for the foreseeable future. Following the assassinations of Duke Avar Wolfgren and Lady Webb, Defiance Bay was thrown into political upheaval. In the ensuing weeks, the streets had become the domain of looters and blackguards. Few dared to step outside their own doors alone or unarmed. But once the dozens had regrouped in the wake of the riots, they quickly put an end to the criminal activity. They patrolled the streets in droves and administered their brand of law on any perceived offenders. This was not the erratic justice of the mob, however. The dozens had taken to heart the strengths of their adversaries, the Knights of the Crucible, and emerged as a far more organized, disciplined force. With the waning strength of the other Defiance Bay powers, the leadership of the dozens took the opportunity to establish its own group as the dominant peacekeeping force in the city. The dozens would soon find themselves overwhelmed by the problems of a leaderless metropolis. But they found an uneasy new partner in the surviving forces of the Crucible Knights, who understood the city's infrastructure and were able to keep the worst of its problems under control. The destruction of the machine atop Ter Noaneth spelled the end of the reanimated corpses in Heritage Hill. Though at first few were willing to venture into the abandoned district, it was soon cleaned out and rebuilt. The district's horrors still fresh in people's minds, it would be some time before it was fully repopulated. But eventually the lure of cheap prime land would all but erase the memory. The Duke's assassination at the apparent hands of an animancer had caused catastrophic rioting in the streets of Defiance Bay. But those who had escaped the melee in the palace hearings remembered the testimonies of the strange guest who had shown up that day and absolved animancy, implicating the leaden key instead. The rumor spread quickly, and soon the popular belief was that the assassin had been a leaden key spy. When the legacy had lifted, People came to see it not as a sign that the riots had been according to the gods' wishes, as Theos had hoped, but as a confirmation that animancy had never been the source of the problem in the first place. Deerwoodans instead convinced themselves that the riots had somehow purged Defiance Bay of Leaden Key spies, and that the end of Widewind's legacy was their well-deserved reward. The rage against animancers was quickly forgotten, and those who had survived were permitted to return to Brackenbury Sanitarium and rebuild it so they might resume their studies. The town of Deerford had seen the last of the cult of Scan. Dark rumors about the town's many curses quickly faded, and travelers soon returned. The fortress of Cadnua emerged as a bastion of security in the midst of an untamed land, becoming the envy of every thane and earl in Deerwood. Legend grew over time of its impregnability, and stories of formidable invaders easily scattered by the keep's defenses became popular around the hearths of Deerwoodinians. Likewise, it also became a beacon to travelers, merchants, and visiting dignitaries alike. Reputed as the finest fortress in all Deerwood, people would journey from near and distant lands alike to experience its fabled hospitality and grandeur. The Audra dragon known as the Master Below, her soul now housed in the body of the huntress Fallen Roet, passed out of Deerwood in relative anonymity, her final destination unknown, even to herself. She was last seen in the port town of Road's End, boarding a ship, an Audra talisman glowing about her neck. Pallegina had missed the opportunity to complete her mission from the Duke's Bells. The Deerwood's trade with Air Glanfath remained weak, but the Valian republics were unable to enter Glenfathan markets. For her repeated insubordination and loss of lucrative trade, Pallegina was cast out of the Brotherhood of Five Suns. She traveled north of the Eastern Reach, where she tried to avoid trouble as a caravan guard, but she could not escape the strange looks and unwanted attention her appearance brought. Adair chose not to return home to Gilded Vale. Through a number of quiet inquiries, he soon found his way into the underground organization of Aethasians known as the Night Market. Ironically, in learning that the gods had been fabricated, Adair found his faith in Aethus renewed, and that his god was neither alive nor truly a god had become irrelevant. He rose quickly through the ranks of the Night Market for his optimism and for his bold leadership, his ultimate goal to make the Deerwood a place that would welcome followers of the Shining God once again. When the dust settled in Sun and Shadow, Aloth looked upon the remains of Theos Ixarchanon, his former master. He saw where the Grand Master had gone wrong and what would be required to undo the harm Theos had wrought. With a flick of his wrist, he burned Theos's robe, headdress, and every other symbol of the man's power. Never again, he vowed, should Kith live in fear and blind obedience to an authority they did not understand. Armed with the knowledge and courage he had gained on his journeys with the Watcher, he set out on the long and lonely task of dismantling the Leaden Key. With both their aims fulfilled, Kanarua bid the Watcher farewell and sailed back to his beloved Rawatai. There, he came before the Lore College, determined to guide his people down a better path. Before his intrigued peers, he spoke of the accomplishments of the great people of Engwith and their efforts to bring peace to Rawatai and the myriad cultures of Aora. He presented the shattered tablet as proof of the Tonvi Oratoa's existence beyond Rawatai's borders and the shared ideals of Aora's peoples. Kana called for a new age in Rawatai culture, where his people might take their place at the forefront of progress and pave the way toward a better future. Kanarua's speech proved inspiring, and his voice came to be considered an influential one in the push toward continued progress in the northern continent. With Theos defeated and the souls released from Sun and Shadow, healthy children were born once again in the Deerwood. The grieving mother sought a place where she might do penance for the birthing bell. She returned to Deerford, where, to the astonishment of the villagers, she delivered the first healthy child in over a decade. She remained there, and with each new birth, she saw a measure of hope restored to the Deerwood and a measure of grace for her own troubled past. Durance continued to blame Woodica for the atrocities of the Saints' War. Believing Magrin to have been a pawn in the machinations of the Queen that was, and feeling that Theos's expulsion had been a step towards reconciliation with his goddess, Durance tried for a time to reopen communication with her. When only silence came, he took it as a condemnation of his continued existence. Ultimately, he built a pyre and threw himself upon it, using his own shattered staff as kindling. You and Sagani never found Persoc together. The Adra figurine had gone dark by the time they emerged from Sun and Shadow, and it was another month before Sagani finally accepted that Persoc's trail had gone cold again. Her search took her beyond the Deerwood and as far as the Living Lands. She saw the great coastal cities of Rawatai and the ruins of Old Valia, absorbing the details of these strange and distant lands. 20 years passed before the Adra figurine finally glowed again. When it did, she followed its signal to a quiet hamlet on the outskirts of Adir. There, she met a young farmer and told her of her past as an elder of Masuk. Sagani returned to a village that had forgotten her face, but remembered her story. Masuk greeted her with cautious warmth, and Sagani found that their ways had become strange to her. She also learned that Kalu had perished of winter fever a few years before, and her middle child, Najuo, had died in a raid. But she found her daughter Yakona a hunter and mother of 3, and her son Malak a builder of mighty walls. In them, she came to find her place in the village, and the familiar contours of a world that had changed in her absence. For you, the death of Theos brought an end to your waking visions, and a silence to the whispers of the past. In their absence, you were able to sleep. The questions of a distant lifetime ceased to trouble your soul. All that remained was what to make of the answer. But at the moment, there was little to be done, and the matter would have to wait. A long journey loomed ahead.